Alrighty. Welcome to this next lecture, Neo-Imperialism in the Transnational Circuits of Whiteness. This week we're kind of continuing in the last section for the class, the last unit for the course, which is all about kind of challenging what we would consider to be the various boundaries around the West, be they geographic boundaries, economic, political, or importantly for this course, cultural boundaries. So if you'll go to the first main slide here, so slide 2 out of 13, this is going to be kind of the framework for this lecture. So when I say framework, what I'm trying to help you kind of get situated for is for the final paper, where you're going to want to develop a theoretical framework of your own, where you link a number of different theories together and kind of say, okay, this is how I'm approaching the cultural practice I'm talking about, by linking these few theories together and then kind of placing that cultural practice into that framework. So when I say a framework for this lecture, I mean a way of thinking about the world through which we're going to approach the various topics about neo-imperialism and about the transnational circuits of whiteness. So, beginning this framework, one of the first things we're kind of, one of the theoretical assumptions for the framework is that new forms of imperialism, or we might say new forms of colonization, are taking place, and that these new forms operate partially through cultural channels, through cultural processes, including through cultural imperialism. So we might say that cultural imperialism is an easy term for the cultural dimension of neo-imperialism or neo-colonization, broadly speaking. And just to kind of revisit what we had talked about last week, that when we're thinking about neo-colonization or when we're thinking about cultural imperialism, we're thinking about kind of a new form of imperialism that's taking place without necessarily direct political and military control of a colony by an imperial nation, but instead through other sorts of means, through new means, thus the prefix neo for neo-imperialism or neo-colonization, through new means, including through cultural imperialism, which involves the kind of promotion and valuing of one culture over another, such that that culture, in this case Western culture, becomes increasingly and more readily available in non-Western places. So our second kind of theoretical assumption is that the boundaries or borders of what we would call the West are unclear and really are complicated through various types of global exchange of ideas, of people, of goods and products, of services, etc. Our next assumption is that investigating the inequalities present in cultural exchange can help kind of clarify the presence and function of cultural imperialism. So, what we're trying to say here is okay, we're in this moment, there's a lot more exchange happening, there's a lot more cultural exchange happening, it's happening through various means. And if we investigate the ways in which that cultural exchange is happening, if we're looking at it, let's say stuff coming from the West to non-Western places or vice versa, if we investigate how it's taking place, right, and see what sort of inequalities are present there, that can help us understand something about how cultural imperialism really works, right? So in this lecture, we're going to be talking at the end about whiteness and about other types of, other sorts of identities, other sorts of Western, kind of valued Western identity categories circulate globally in ways that are not equal, right? And thus can help us kind of understand how cultural imperialism works through identity, through beauty, through skin tone, and all these other things. Our next assumption is that the operations of globalization or transnationalism or cultural imperialism, right, three related but not perfectly synonymous processes, that these operations have different effects on women, on sexual minorities, on people of color, on poor people, and on other marginalized groups, right? In other words, they exaggerate systems of oppression. So neo-imperialism isn't just a national thing, right? Involving Western nations and non-Western nations, but it's actually a thing that involves sexism, involves racism, involves capitalism, right, or classism, etc. And finally, that the last thing that's really important and really important to stress is that when we're talking about cultural globalism, cultural transnationalism, we're not talking about culture as though it is this thing entirely distinct from this other thing called the economy and from this other thing called the political realm, right? We really stressed this at the beginning of the class, but it's important to revisit that culture is political, culture is economic, and really important for this when we're looking at what sort of exchange is taking place and whether or not it's equal is understanding that global cultural exchange is economic, involving labor, right? And also involving the exchange of cultural products for profit. And this is going to be really important for this lecture. So on to the next slide here, just to kind of revisit and review, cultural imperialism refers to the practice of promoting and imposing, right? And this is very important, not just promotion, but imposing a culture, usually that of a more powerful nation over a less powerful society, and that this is a process that kind of determines general cultural values and standardizes civilizations. A wonderful definition that comes straight out of Wikipedia. So, cultural imperialism is accomplished through a range of means that could be categorized, as we did last week, under the three components of systematic oppression, right? So, cultural imperialism is involving institutional practices, is involving ideologies about different cultures, right? And in particular, a kind of hierarchical ideology about the superiority of Western culture over non Western cultures. And then finally, involves specific individual behaviors that really help kind of manifest these various processes. So we're going to look in this lecture a bit at consumerism in part, through a little bit at beauty products, and other things that are kind of involve these individual consumerist behaviors. So on to slide 4 now, or our third content slide, slide 4 of 13. More about cultural imperialism. It's important to stress, and we kind of hit this on the last slide, that it's not simply a neutral way to describe a transnational trend, right? It's not simply about the promotion of a certain cultural practice or product that just happens to be popular globally at a certain time, right? But it specifically refers to a form of cultural domination, right? Thus the imposition that we talked about on the last slide that is thought to harm rather than help people in the global south. So when we say cultural imperialism, we're really trying to refer to something negative, right? We never intend to use cultural imperialism as a positive thing. However, many aspects of cultural imperialism often get touted as progress, as development, or as civilization, right? Like literally that things are becoming more civilized because of cultural imperialism and its various processes. So it's important to understand here that not everything from another culture is bad to consider, importing into one's own nation or one's own location or culture, right? So again, this is kind of like thinking back to cultural relativism, that it's not just about being like hands off, each culture has their own thing. There is this middle ground, so we don't need to be opposed to cultural exchange, right? In general, right? But cultural imperialism is concerned with power, with agency, and with decolonial cultural exchange specifically. So on here to the next slide now, slide 5. So I just said these three things: power, agency, and decolonial cultural exchange. So these are three things that are very important to think about when trying to understand and assess whether or not something could be described as cultural imperialism, right? And not just to describe it that way, but to understand how it works, right? To be able to better understand it, to better combat it. So the first thing we can look at is power, right? And here again, we're like trying to approach this question of, okay, there's this moment, there's a lot more cultural exchange happening, a lot more exchange in general taking place. So is this exchange good or is this exchange bad? So let's look at this first thing: power. So who has the ability or power to make their culture available to the world, to make it desirable in other parts of the world, and really to make it consumed in other parts of the world, right? So first we want to ask whether or not what's taking place is something that everybody has the power to do, or whether or not there's only certain groups, right, or only certain countries that have the ability to have that done, right? So let's take, for example, the question of a certain media enterprise. One of the reasons that the internet is so interesting, especially for thinking about kind of progressive social movements, is because of the fact that it has relatively easy or relatively low access points, right? It's relatively easy nowadays in more and more places in the world every single day for somebody to be able to access, let's say like I'm doing, something to record themselves and put a video of themselves online, right? So creating something like an online YouTube video maybe is something that has easier access, right? However, to be able to have, let's say, your television show on a major network, right, to have your television show be something that's aired globally requires a large amount of resources, a large amount of access, and typically would require you to be located in a Western nation, right? Which is to say that Western television shows are oftentimes dubbed over and available on channels all over the world, dubbed in other languages or with subtitles. Whereas in the United States, it's very, very rare for people to consume non English television shows with English subtitles, right? So, pretty much most of the people in the United States who consume non English stuff speak that language in addition to speaking English. Right. So this is that question of power. And by asking this question, we can kind of begin to get an understanding for what's taking place, right? This question of access, of who has the ability, who has the power to be able to create a cultural product like this, to make it, promote it, to make it desirable around the world so people will consume it, right? And this isn't to say that this tells us everything we need to know about a product, right? So let's say, to go back to that example of a television show, just because something comes out of the United States, right, as a television show, and maybe channels in other countries don't have the resources to create shows that are desirable and to promote those shows and make them desirable on a global level, right? There's this real question of access. That doesn't mean that we should be like, okay, all American television shows are terrible and we shouldn't watch them, etc., right? No. But we should then be asking ourselves, okay, well, if these American television shows are trying to construct themselves and promote themselves in a way that makes them desirable all over the world, what sorts of values are these television shows embodying, right? And by asking that question, we can say, okay, well, is this a good television show or is this a bad television show, right? And I think that's really just hitting at something very basic, very understandable, which is like sometimes we watch TV shows or other things and we're just like, this isn't good. Like, this is pretty problematic, right? And that's important to consider when we think about the fact that American television shows and Western cultural products in general are made very, very readily available around the world without the same sort of exchange always taking place the way in the opposite direction, right? So then this next question we have here is agency, okay? So power and agency are two different things, but they're two very closely related questions, right? So when we're talking about agency, we're talking about not just the choice um, or the ability to choose, right? But the ability to make a choice without serious benefits, right? To make a choice without serious harms coming to you, right? So, like if you hold a gun to somebody's head and tell them to do something, technically they have the power to not do that thing, right? But then you might shoot them. However, so we might say that they don't have the agency to say no, right? That it's not really a free choice, a free decision, even though they have, one might say, the power to make that decision. So power and agency are two really important concepts to consider together, right? And so agency kind of having to do with about having a free and unencumbered choice, right? So when we're thinking about cultural exchange, we might ask who has a choice as to which cultural products they consume and who does not have a choice, okay? When we think about like the average experience in a supermarket in the United States, you think of tons and tons and tons of choice, right? Tons of choice of products from the United States, from all over the world, right? Um, when you think about what's affordable and available, right, there might be a lot of choices still to choose from at your average supermarket, right? When you think about contexts all over the world, some of these factors change, right? A lot of them might remain the same in other kind of Western heavily capitalist nations in Europe, it's like, and also in Canada. However, in other places, right, the sorts of choices that are made available to you and the ability to choose those things because of their affordability is oftentimes much more constricted, so that maybe you'll only have one product that you can choose from or two products to choose from that you can actually afford to buy, right? Now, this is complicated by the fact that oftentimes Western cultural products are made available for very, very little, right? For comparatively little in non Western places. in a way that makes those products more desirable because they're cheap, right? And often in a way that compels people, in particular poor people, to have to buy those products, right? And you can read a whole bunch of interesting things about things such as like real rampant problems with addiction to Coca-Cola in places in the global South because of the fact that Coca-Cola is heavily promoted and oftentimes even in certain ways subsidized to allow it to be so much cheaper in all these places around the world, right? The same thing has happened with tons of other products. So, for example, there's this fantastic documentary that I love to teach with, though now it's kind of a bit older, so I don't use it as much anymore, but it's called Life and Debt. And the documentary is really focused in Jamaica and the way in which Jamaica's economy has been affected by processes of economic globalization that have made it so that Western products, right, Western agricultural products, are now so cheap in Jamaica that actual Jamaican farmers can't compete and largely have become unemployed, and farms have been closed because Western products come in for less money than it costs them to produce Jamaican products because the U.S. government subsidizes a lot of U.S. agricultural products, right? So. So when we're thinking about agency, right, we want to think about, okay, who really has a choice to consume what products, right, and whose products are available where and for cheap, right? And through that, we can kind of also be asking, okay, who's profiting from this sort of exchange? And that leads us to our next question, our last question, our third sort of metric, which is about decolonial cultural exchange. So again, we're not like anti-cultural exchange. We're not anti global circuits of goods and people and ideas, right? But we are curious about whether or not it's happening in a way that challenges already existent power imbalances on a global scale, right? In particular, power imbalances between different countries. Okay, so when we're asking this question, is it decolonial, right? Not colonial or neo-colonial or neo-imperial, but is it decolonial, right? This cultural exchange that's happening. We might ask, does this movement of cultural products and practices help combat or reinforce the effects of traditional colonialism or imperialism, right? Is it helping get people in the global South out of poverty? Is it helping prevent wars that would seek to extract resources from places in the global South, right? Asking questions like this, right, to determine whether or not it's really kind of entering in and intervening in processes of neo-imperialism is really important. So, on to our next slide here, slide 6. The next step in analysis is to kind of then turn towards the identitarian aspects of this cultural exchange, right? Because if you remember earlier, back on our first slide with the framework we introduced for this lecture, we're trying to make the argument that cultural imperialism, or even more broadly speaking, neo-imperialism in general, neo-colonization in general, that these things are taking place in ways that exaggerate other systems of oppression, right? So it's not just about like all of America benefits over countries in the global South, but specifically that systems of racism, of sexism, of classism, of Christianism, etc., are reinforced both in the global North or in the West and in the global South or in the East because of cultural imperialism. So we want to start looking at that exchange and asking additional questions, right? So, for example, why is one gendered, racial, or sexual practice seen as more desirable globally, right? So, if certain things are only popular or certain things that are popular are only coming out of the West, right? And other versions of those same things coming out of the East are not nearly as popular, like certain types of music, right? Certain types of clothing, certain types of food, right? Then we might ask, why is it more desirable that something coming from this place, right, is why is it more desirable? And we might continue to ask then, is this something that is race, that is class, that is gendered, right? So if we're thinking about something like makeup, like beauty, right, and what's considered to be attractive, oftentimes what we'll notice is that some of the global trends around attractiveness emerge from the West and then enter into and kind of colonize, neo-colonize places in the East and in the global South, okay? Um, so this next question then, is this desirability a result of cultural relativism, right? So we can say, okay, well, is it just like this sort of, okay, well, this happens to be popular right now, it's a harmless thing that just happens to be really popular, right? Like, let's say if hot dogs were popular all over the world, someone might say, well, hot dogs are just tasty and they're just really popular all over the place, and that's fine, it is what it is, right? There's lots of different good foods, and this one just happens to be popular right now, this sort of hands-off cultural relativism, right? Or might we say that it's more of a culturally imperialistic tendency when we look, let's say, back to last week at thinking about the kind of the differences between the discourses around hijab and around bikinis, right? So whether or not this has anything to do with like this inherent kind of superiority of a certain dress style is just cooler, is prettier, or something else? Or is this about kind of culturally imperialist ideologies about Western femininity being superior to non-Western femininities, right? This next question, we might say, do racial or sexual minorities or women in the place from which this practice emerges report feeling liberated, feeling helped, or otherwise advanced by the practice, right? So we can look at this when we're thinking about, okay, is there a Western practice, right, or Western cultural product that we see entering into non-Western contexts? And if we do, and we're looking first at the West, where this product is coming from, or this practice is coming from, do women in the West feel or typically report feeling happy about this product, right? So if we think about something like the bikini becoming culturally normalized all over the world, right? If we were to look at what women in the United States report about the bikini, do they generally report that it's something that they identify as being a positive thing, as being helpful for feelings of body positivity, or would they say that it's something that kind of feels like it's used to police women's bodies in various ways, right? I leave that answer up to you. You can imagine where someone who's a teacher of gender and women's studies would likely lean in response to that question, right? But asking questions like that can help us kind of unpack some of these questions about whether or not what's being exported from, let's say, the West to non-Western contexts is even desirable in the first place for the people that it most affects, right? So then the next thing we could ask is, does the importation of this practice happen alongside the export of other related cultural practices? And this is kind of just this basic question of a two-way street, right? Let's say the United States is sending McDonald's like all over the world, right? So that everywhere you go, you're likely to run into a McDonald's in every major city, right? Of course, this isn't actually true, but like I'm exaggerating, no doubt. Do we see similar exchanges taking place with non-Western restaurants becoming immensely popular in the United States, right? A lot of people can make an argument that, yeah, we do see that because there's a ton of availability of food from all different kind of national or ethnic backgrounds across the US. Other people might argue and say, no, well, we haven't seen any like major chain restaurants from other countries enter into the United States and become popular here. Now, the final question we could ask is, does the importation of these cultural norms represent the growth of a hegemonic mode of gender identity, of racial formation, or of sexuality, sexual identity, sexual politics? And this is a really important question to ask. So, before we get too deep into talking about this concept of hegemony, we should first go back and look at sort of the history of imperialism and culture and identity. So, on this next slide, slide 7, we can begin with the question of gender and cultural imperialism. So, in the West, largely for a long time, there's been this kind of strict enforcement of a two and only two gender system, right? Kind of as a cultural system, as a scientific system, and as a political system, economic system, etc., right? But in particular, we're thinking about it as a cultural system that kind of normalizes and even violently enforces the normalization of a two and only two sex gender system. Now, in non-Western contexts, we haven't seen such a consistent enforcement of a binary system of gender identification. However, during colonization, during imperialism, right, all over the world, there's been the imposition of on indigenous Americans through the arrival of Europeans. There's been this imposition of a two and only two gender system, right? And this has meant largely the violent erasure of Two Spirit and Berdache as two groups of individuals in indigenous Native American groups who have identified outside of a gender binary of strictly male and female. And not only in the United States, but all across non-Western contexts, a two and only two-sex gender system has been imposed through European colonization of Africa, of Asia, and of the Middle East. So, to a large degree, a two and only two gender system hasn't just been enforced in non Western contexts through colonization, but it's also become an axis or a lens for justifying Western white supremacy and violence while representing Eastern cultures as perverse and backwards, right? So during the time period of colonization, of imperialism, the West created a lot of narratives that were directed towards the East that would say, oh, like, look at these people, they have more than two genders, and therefore they are this backwards, savage, kind of uncivilized group of people. Right. And this was done through a range of kind of discursive means. Now, today, we still see processes that kind of force the mainstreaming of a two and only two gender system. And this is largely through the promotion of types of hegemonic masculinity and hegemonic femininity um, globally, right? So that we see this sign of kind of Western femininity and Western masculinity that are being constructed and promoted as desirable globally right now. And another thing that we could point to as an easy example is the way in which gender-based issues are oftentimes used as as a reason, as a justification for starting wars. So you encounter this narrative of like, we have to go to the Middle East to save women from the horrible abuses that they're facing there, right? And again, as we talked about last week when we're thinking about this cultural imperialism versus cultural relativism thing, right? We might ask ourselves, well, what purposes does it serve to talk about non-Western contexts that way? And does it potentially serve to silence discussions about real gender-based issues that are happening in the West, in the United States, right? So we really still see kind of like, you know, this old cultural history of enforcing a two and only two sex and gender system through colonization and imperialism continue to manifest in neo-imperialism or in cultural imperialism today. So on to the next slide here, slide 8, we can also look at this kind of same question, the same history with race. So in the United States, the representation of natives and blacks as literally inferior biologically, as less than human, as a biopolitical project, right? Through actual science publications, through things like the one drop rule, the three-fifths compromise, even through things like anti-miscegenation laws that prevented marriage and sexual relationships between blacks and whites. All these things kind of are part of the history of colonization of blacks, of Africans, both internally through slavery within the United States and through practices of colonization in Africa itself. In European history, we see the same thing, and through a number of additional means, right, including through direct military control of various colonies throughout Africa and the Middle East and in Asia, and the kind of implementation of a system of cultural kind of white hegemony that promoted white values, white aesthetics in those colonies. You also saw this sort of particular brand of European kind of missionary work, where Christian missionaries would go on what were called civilizing missions to help bring civilization to non-Western places, right? Um, Now, contemporarily, we see a lot of the same things continue in different ways. The underrepresentation and misrepresentation of racial minorities in media in the West, popular criticism of non white cultural aesthetics. So things like braids, cornrows, dreads, sagging pants, loose clothing, hoods, white clothing kind of being seen as the only acceptable professional attire through this sort of European suit and tie combination. Criticism of other non-white cultural practices, so things like rap music, strong smelling food in your apartment building, stuff like this that we still see people complain about a lot, and also the representation of non-Western cities and places as outdated and inferior. Um, this is kind of like akin to what we talked about last week with Orientalism, and also really important to this lecture and this week, the kind of constructed desirability of white skin. So, now we're going to go on the next slide, slide 9 now, to talk about this concept of hegemony. And hegemony is really important to understand the significance of cultural imperialism, because hegemony is something that now can happen on a global scale in new ways because of what's made available in this sort of transnational and global moment, right? So what's it made available in terms of these new circuits of exchange of cultural goods, of people, ideas, of products, of services, etc. So So when I say hegemony, I'm referring to the political, social, cultural, or economic predominance, right, of one idea, power, entity over others, right, over another, over all others. So when we're talking about hegemony, we're talking about like near to complete control, right? So now hegemony, right, is never something that can really be complete, which is to say that there will always be people who act against hegemony. There will always be places that kind of fall outside of hegemonic relations. However, you could say that hegemony is a constant moving towards. Hegemony refers to a process, right, where things are moving towards this kind of predominance of one entity over all others. And we can talk in our field specifically about cultural hegemony, referring to the predominance of one cultural form over others, a form to which the majority of people kind of consent and participate in and value and support, right? So when we're thinking about global cultural hegemony, we're thinking about what things nowadays have reached a point where, almost wherever you go, you can find that thing. And not just find it, but that it's desirable, right? Um, and this could be something as simple as food, right? Or it could be something much more complicated. Like for our class, we might look at something like gender. So we might talk about masculinity, or femininity. We might talk about race with whiteness or other things as becoming culturally hegemonic. Okay? Now, in a transnational world, Western cultural hegemony extends globally through practices of cultural imperialism. So, we could talk about cultural hegemony or Western cultural, or let's say American cultural hegemony within the context of the United States, right? As moving to as a certain kind of culture that's moving towards being hegemonic within the United States. But we might also talk about American cultural values starting to become hegemonic globally, right? Or maybe not cultural values per se, but different cultural practices or products. So when we're thinking about hegemony in a global world, right, we can think about it in relationship to cultural imperialism by trying to continue to investigate this question of what does cultural imperialism look like and what effects does it have. And one of those effects is that cultural imperialism is a process that allows cultural hegemony to expand to a global scale, and that oftentimes, more often than not, that move towards hegemony is the move towards the predominance of Western cultural practices or products or values. So on the next slide here, we can kind of get to a better understanding of this specifically by looking at the question of gender. So in one of the articles this week on masculinities and globalization, the author Connell describes a world gender order as the structure of relationships that interconnect the gender regimes of institutions and the gender roles of local society on a world scale. So Connell's trying to capture that in this moment of globalization, of transnationalism, there is actually a structure, right, an infrastructure, a series of networks, of connected actors, of connected institutions that are connected on a global scale, right, in various ways, some formal, some informal, some discursive, some through actual practices, and that this kind of huge network, this huge connected regime, um, allows for the expression of a particular type of gender, right? Globally, at the same time that it suppresses other sorts of genders from getting, or other sorts of expressions of gender from getting the same sort of representation globally. So, looking at this kind of concept of world gender order, Connell describes a few things that are important to it. So first off, it's multi-scalar, right? When we're talking about scale, we could say like local, state, national, global, right? Things like this. So it's multi-scalar, connecting the local to the global, right? So the world gender order is something that circulates globally, but has effects that go all the way down to the local level, to the individual level, right? It's transnational. It's emerging in this transnational moment of global commerce, trade, cultural exchange, communication. Also, very important, it's not monolithic. It still varies person to person, place to place. And this has to do with hegemony, right? That we're talking about hegemony as being something that's always being moved towards, right? It's never complete. but it always involves these processes that try and make it as complete as possible. And finally, it's influenced by the globalization of various institutions. So Connell kind of describes a couple things that are useful to talk about for this class. Really importantly for their article is this question of hegemonic masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity is the made-to-be desired form of masculinity that is represented globally, that emerges from the West, and is spread and contested through institutional, ideological, and individual axes, right? So this is a really complex, really broad definition that addresses this sort of systemic nature of hegemony, right? This involvement of institutions, of ideologies or belief systems, and individual behaviors, right? It kind of captures this notion of hegemony as being kind of moving towards, right? That it's never complete, but it can oftentimes affect a majority of people, right? Hint here, you can think about normativity from earlier lectures. Right, and then it has this kind of systemic side to it. And at the same time, we can also talk about hegemonic femininity, the made to be desired form of femininity that is represented globally, emerges from the West again, and is spread and contested through institutional, ideological, and individual axes. So on the next slide here, we can kind of take the same notion of hegemonic masculinity or hegemonic femininity and apply the same notion of hegemony and cultural imperialism in the transnational moment to the question of race. So much as with gender norms, ones with which privilege masculinity over femininity, hegemonic racial categories are spread transnationally, and that these typically involve hegemonic whiteness, right? And this is both the specific form that whiteness takes at any moment in particular places, and the preferred, normal, or normative form as it is constructed as desirable and privileged globally. So, hegemonic whiteness refers to both kind of this process of moving towards hegemony that values whiteness as a racial category and white aesthetics and white culture, and at the same time also as individual expressions of whiteness and of preferred whiteness in various contexts. So, hegemonic whiteness is a systemic process, one which involves institutional practices, individual behaviors, and ideological belief systems that value whiteness over non whiteness or being a person of color. This kind of processual side of hegemonic whiteness has a number of harmful effects, harmful reverberations transnationally. So the first would be the implementation of Western racial orderings in non-Western contexts, ones which ultimately end up privileging whiteness in the global South, right? So we're talking about these kind of racial hierarchies with whiteness on the top of the hierarchy that are kind of being implemented or instituted in non-Western contexts. The next thing that we see is kind of the privileging of white or light skin through a range of cultural, medical, and other practices in diverse contexts globally. And when you look at, and we'll talk about this a tiny bit in a moment, but when you look at the Yearning for Lightness reading, and when you look at the Illusionist documentary, you see a lot of the various ways in which whiteness is pursued through as an aesthetic through a range of medical and other beauty related practices. And so finally, the normalization of the oppressive systems which are part and parcel with the privileging of whiteness. And when we're talking about this, what we're trying to hint at is that it's not simply just like this preference for white skin that's kind of globalized, but this preference for this whole range of various practices, products, lifestyles, and aesthetics that are associated with whiteness emerging from the West. So on the next slide here, we can turn now to the question of women and to really open up this question of how neo-imperialism relates to women. And there's a lot of different ways to talk about this, but we're going to focus in on one. So as processes of neoliberalism, including cultural imperialism, are known to exaggerate other systems of oppression, remember this is part of our framework for the lecture, neo-imperialism therefore has important implications for women and gender studies. And one way we'll approach this question is through taking two intersecting systems, sexism and capitalism, and trying to understand how they're amplified by neo-imperialism. So, in this moment of globalization, through a range of economic forms of globalization, cultural forms of globalization, we see a number of things happening at the intersection of sexism and capitalism, or sexism and classism. So, first is the use of women for underpaid and poorly regulated labor that's often done under the assumption of one, devalued women's worth, right? Which we know to be already kind of reflected in the huge disparities between how much women and men are paid for the same work. And then also the assumption that women have a very low likelihood of going on strike, right? Or rebelling against their bosses. Next, we also see the forced exchange of women globally through systems of domestic and sexual trafficking. And finally, and something that we'll be talking about for the last slide of this lecture, but also something we'll be talking about in the other lecture for this week, is the cultivation of a women's consumerist culture, privileging Western cultural products, companies, and consumerist ideologies. Okay, so that in this kind of global transnational moment of cultural and economic exchange, Western companies are trying to promote consumerist practices in non-Western contexts that they'll be able to turn a profit off of. So on the last slide here, we can kind of bring it all together and talk briefly about the one of the readings for this week, Yearning for Lightness by Eve Nakano Glenn. In it, Glenn explores the transnational circuits of whiteness, the ways in which whiteness becomes valued outside of Western white contexts. So in her discussion, we see multiple systems of oppression coming into cooperation with one another, coming into kind of uniform function. So first is the system of capitalism, again through the development of a global consumerist culture targeting the global south with Western products. Next, through the system of sexism, right? Through the targeting of women specifically through the promotion of Western beauty aesthetics, ranging from clothing styles to makeup and cosmetic surgery. And then finally, through the system of racism with the specific promotion of light skin as a desirable aesthetic for women. So when we're looking at the question of whiteness, or the question of gender, or the question of class, or the question of nationhood, we see that those questions are already implicated within other questions. And this comes back to this question of intersectionality and these systems working often in unison. But within the larger context of this lecture and this kind of question of neo-imperialism and cultural imperialism as the cultural extension of that, we can certainly say that neo-imperialism kind of feeds off of the logic and off of the practices or structural kind of functions of other systems of repression, of capitalism, of sexism, of racism, in order to kind of expand, right? In order to take effect. So it's not simply something that happens from Americans towards non-Americans in the global south, right? But it's something that specifically typically benefits more white, straight, heterosexual, male, wealthy Christians, right? And similarly, we could say more harms or targets people of various marginalized backgrounds in the global south. So, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and make sure to pair it with the other lecture for this week on the Middle East that also talks more about this question of cultural imperialism and about the concept of consumerist culture in non-Western contexts. Thanks.